who were the top fantasy performers in Week 1?
For sure. Yep. So really targeted 3 different guys to share with the audience today. So our number 1 fantasy performer, and I'm going to do it in 3 different areas, 1 for FanDuel, 1 for DraftKings, 1 for Yahoo. They have a little bit of different scoring. So FanDuel's more of your standard scoring system. And for Week 1, Andrew Luck actually led the field, despite Drew Brees putting up some pretty big numbers in the second half of Sunday's slate. Andrew Luck ended up with 35.5 fantasy points in Week 1.
Very impressive.
Which is pretty crazy. Yeah, he had a great game. That was a great game to watch overall. Moving on to DraftKings, top fantasy performer on DraftKings was actually A.J. Green. Finished with 39 fantasy points on DraftKings, with 12 catches for 180 yards and touchdowns. So, big dog from the wide receiver spot on DraftKings. And then Yahoo, while Andrew Luck was the top fantasy performer, I wanted to also share with the audience and kind of highlight Angelo Williams on Monday night. He ended up putting up 32.1 fantasy points. So if you waited all the way to Monday and had a couple guys still left to go, and you had Williams on your team, you did pretty well.
It was a good weekend for those 3 for sure. I want to take a minute just real quick. I think my mic was off when I brought you in and introduced you there. I'm now getting feedback, so I think now all the technical difficulties are taken care of. But joining us now is Jeremy from thedirtcannon.com. He's here to enlighten us again this week. And you guys caught his answer to the question, but I don't think you caught me asking the question. So what he was speaking about there was who the top fantasy performers were in Week 1 for those 3 different sites there. So let's get into the second question now that everybody can hear me too. Who are some guys that we expected to do well this weekend that didn't quite live up to the bill?
Absolutely. Yeah, so on our sports information section, just for the audience, just so they know, we publish everything we're going to talk about every Wednesday night is also available at thedirtcannon.com, and our sports information, you can just search for the keyword Real Deal Sports Talk. That said, in terms of fantasy bombs for Week 1, we had Des Bryant was probably the biggest bomb across the board for those that thought he'd have a big day. 1 catch, 8 yards. FanDuel scoring is 1.3 fantasy points.
Ouch.
Terrible, right? Yeah, so for his salary that they've assigned to him on FanDuel, he's actually the worst points per dollar spent in Week 1. On DraftKings, our fantasy dud of the week was Todd Gurley. It was really, if you watched the Monday night game, stuck it out for that Niners-Rams game. It was a tough watch for sure.
It was definitely hard to watch.
Todd Gurley finished with only 5 fantasy points, which is the lowest amount of fantasy production in his short career thus far. And our last one that I think a lot of people had a lot of high hopes on, especially given the quarterback situation in Minnesota, was actually Adrian Peterson. He finished the day with only 3.1 fantasy points on Yahoo in Week 1.
Yeah, Tennessee really just bottled him up and did not let him beat them.
That is the case. That is the case, my brother.
So on the opposite side of that, who are some guys that excelled that maybe we didn't have on our rosters?
Absolutely. So if you've been following Dirt Cannon, one of the guys that we were really high on but wasn't really necessarily projected very well, but certainly a guy we tried to let everybody know was Spencer Ware. He was the number 2 fantasy running back for the weekend. On FanDuel, finished with 29.4 fantasy points. It's probably a 1-week wonder. In fact, has a sprained toe, so might not even play for the upcoming week. And then obviously we'll have to kind of play it by ear with Jamal Charles coming back into the lineup and getting into the mix. But for Week 1, Spencer Ware was a fantasy stud that was pretty low salary. On DraftKings, as far as a fantasy stud that I don't even think a lot of people have ever even heard of, Willie Snead. He was the number 5 wide receiver in fantasy scoring on DraftKings. He finished with 36.2 fantasy points. And really, if you had him or Cooks, but if you played them both, I mean, look out, you probably did very well.
Yeah, you were probably also a Saints fan.
Yeah, right? Exactly. There was a lot of yards up and down. That was a good game, too. On Yahoo, a fantasy stud that showed up pretty big, especially in the second half as that game got down to the wire, was Theo Riddick. for the Lions. Came in at 25.3 fantasy points as the backup running back. In fact, both running backs for Detroit went over 20 fantasy points, which had only been done once by two running backs on the same team in the last 3 fantasy seasons.
Excellent. Go ahead, Detroit. Pat yourselves on the back.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. Get a victory, right?
Right. We'll take it. We normally figure out a way to lose those games. We'll take it. We'll take it.
I bet.
So, we had the top fantasy guys in week 1. Who's going to be able to be another week 2 performer? Are they going to be able to repeat? Can luck do it again?
Absolutely. So in terms of just FanDuel potential for a repeat performance, our number 1 QB is actually going to be Drew Brees again this week. He goes up against Giants defense that might have looked a little bit better than they'll pan out for the whole season, going up against a rookie quarterback in week 1. And for those of you who recall last year when Drew Brees played the Giants, he put up 48.3 fantasy points in one game with 7 touchdowns for the last time those two teams met up last season. So look for Brees to continue his hot streak to kick off the season. Our second potential for a repeat performance is A.J. Green. So A.J. Green obviously led wide receivers in fantasy scoring in week 1. In looking at DraftKings potential, he hasn't scored less than 15 fantasy points in the last 6 times that he's gone up against the Steelers defense. So
wow.
Look for him to be another big fantasy producer for week 2. And our third guy is actually for our local fans here, C.J. Anderson, who we predicted last week would have a big game against Carolina's defense. And he came out with 2 touchdowns, and this week he gets to play the Colts defense, who, as I just mentioned, gave up the most fantasy points to running backs in week 1. So look for C.J. Anderson to keep his hot streak alive and put up some big numbers in week 2 again.
All right, guys, if you got those players, you better start them. Don't sit them.
That's right. That's right. Start those guys for sure.
All right, so let's do some start 'em, sit 'em, and who's going to win these games. So I've picked out some games to talk about. And we'll start with the Thursday night game. Who should we start? Who should we sit? And who do you guys see winning?
Absolutely. So, Jets versus Bills Thursday night. One of the guys that I'm personally really high on to have a bounce back performance is going to be Brandon Marshall. I think he'll get back into the flow and he'll have a solid performance. Look for about 20 fantasy points out of Brandon Marshall.
Mm-hmm.
On the Buffalo side, I would definitely look to start LaShawn McCoy. He's really the only guy that did much of anything for Buffalo in week 1.
Right.
Jets defense isn't going to give up and get torched like they did against the Bengals. Buffalo and the Jets know each other pretty well, which is why, as far as a player to avoid in that matchup, I'd avoid Tyrod Taylor for this game.
Mm-hmm.
Dirk Cannon's got this game projected to be 23-10 Jets.
All right. I will have to agree. I will take the Jets in this game as well. Let's go with the local game. We got the Broncos, Colts coming into town. Start 'em, sit 'em. Who you got winning?
Yeah, so just like we said a moment ago, probably the number 1 running back, certainly from a Dirk Cannon projection standpoint, is going to be C.J. Anderson. Look for him to have a solid game against a pretty suspect Colts defense. Also, with Demaryius Thomas being injured and currently his status unknown for week 2, if he does in fact miss, look for Emmanuel Sanders to have a big role in that game, and Trevor Siemian to look for him with about 15 targets in this upcoming game. On the Colts side, obviously if you've got Luck playing, he might come back and be the number 1 fantasy QB for the whole season. That's what we've been saying throughout the whole off season from the Dirk Cannon. And a fantasy sleeper that came out had a big performance in week 1 that not many people are going to recognize the name, but Jack Doyle, tight end for the Colts, 17 fantasy points last week, and that's going to be kind of a blanket check-down guy for the Colts in this upcoming week against the tough Denver's D. Dirk Cannon actually has the Colts pulling away big in this game, 37-20 over the Broncos. Personally, I think it's a little bit lower scoring, with Broncos pulling out a victory 21-20.
I would have to agree more so with you on that one than Dirk Cannon right there. I think it's going to be a low-scoring game, and right now I got to ride that Broncos defense over what I'm seeing out of the Colts. Then again,
Absolutely.
the Lions could not cover their tight ends to save their life last week, so we'll have to see. We'll see if the Broncos linebackers and safeties can do a little better job than we did.
Yeah, if they get to luck early and often, it'll be low scoring for sure.
Yeah. So the Seahawks, they're bringing the Rams in. The Rams, as we know, pitiful game the other night against the 49ers. Do the Rams have a shot in this game? Do we start anybody for L.A.?
I wouldn't start a Ram for the rest of the season unless you absolutely had to, and that means you've got Gurley in a season-long format, and you got to kind of roll with him. But even at this point, Seahawks D is tough against the run, and the Rams' quarterback play is so terrible that they're just going to stack the box and say, beat me, Case. And if it's not Case, I don't think the Rams have a quarterback that could beat the Seahawks defense. I do think they'll put up some points this week, so it won't be a complete shutout. Dirk Cannon's got Seattle winning this game 19-10. One thing of note, if you do bet on these games, the team that got blown out the most the previous week has covered the spread 85% of the time the following week. And the Seahawks are currently listed at a 14-point favorite over the Rams. So look for the Rams to cover, but still not win that game.
Right. They got to come out with some pride this week.
That's right. Especially in a game in Los Angeles. It's going to be nice.
So this game you might have some personal interest in. I believe you're a Falcons fan. Falcons got the Raiders. Raiders, as we know, they went balls to the wall last week, 2-point win. Who do we start? Who do we sit? And who do you guys got winning?
Absolutely. So Falcons-Raiders matchup, we have this being a really high-scoring game, close down to the finish, Oakland pulling it out late, 34-28. In terms of fantasy players, they're really all over the field. Look for Matt Ryan and Julio Jones to continue their fantasy performance. Julio Jones should get about 15 to 20 targets in this game, and now that they've felt out a little bit how Sanu fits into their offense. And on the Oakland side of the ball, look for Amari Cooper and Derek Carr to light up Atlanta's secondary, who couldn't stop Jameis Winston, who threw 4 touchdowns last week. So look for that duo to continue.
Okay.
And as always, running back against Falcons is a solid play. Murray should get over 100 yards, and I have him scoring 2 touchdowns. So any of those guys is going to be a lock on any of your fantasy teams this week.
All right, there you go, guys. If you're a Raiders fan, if you got Murray, go ahead and play him this week.
Play him.
So these are 2 teams. They opened up the beginning of the season with wins. Texans' offense and their receivers looked very good in the first game, I think. The Chiefs had the big emotional comeback against the Chargers. Alex Smith put up big passing numbers. We talked about Spencer Ware. How do you guys see this one going? Who should we start and who should we stay away from?
Yeah, so this one's a pretty interesting game. Chiefs played Texans twice last season, blew them out in both appearances.
Yep.
The number one guy to have in both of those games is Travis Kelce. So if you're looking for a tight end who's still not on this, he's probably that mid-range, what we call it the Dirk Cannon, a notable salary for FanDuel, DraftKings, or Yahoo. Travis Kelce's a good tight end to take a look at this week. He's got a good matchup against Houston defense.